The air in the community clubhouse annex smelled of stale coffee and industrial-grade carpet cleaner. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sterile, greenish pallor on the dozen faces arranged around a cheap folding table. Grayson Fallon shifted his weight on the flimsy plastic chair, the kind designed for maximum discomfort. He felt profoundly out of place. His work-worn hands, clean but calloused, rested on his knees. He was used to the scent of hay and hydraulic fluid, the solid heft of a wrench, not the flimsy precarity of this room. He had been summoned. The letter, printed on heavy cream-colored cardstock, bearing the embossed logo of the Harvest View Meadows Homeowners Association, had used the word invited. It felt more like an indictment. At the head of the table sat Karen McGrath, president of the board of directors. Her blonde bob was a marvel of engineering, a helmet of perfect symmetry. Her lavender blazer was immaculate, her smile a fixed, pleasant curve that never quite reached her eyes. She radiated a kind of serene, unyielding authority. "Thank you for joining us, Mr. Fallon," she began, her voice smooth and measured. "This is the Architectural Control Committee, and we're here today to discuss the structure you've been erecting along the eastern boundary of your property." Grayson kept his expression neutral. "It's a fence, Mrs. McGrath, and a gate. It's on my land." A man to her right, a portly fellow with a tie cinched too tight, cleared his throat. "Be that as it may, the section in question abuts the association's designated common area. Specifically, the area slated for the future Serenity Trail. The fence is a good 10 feet inside my surveyed property line," Grayson stated, his voice low and even. He had brought the survey map, folded neatly in his coat pocket, but he knew instinctively it would be pointless to produce it now. This wasn't about facts. This was about something else. Karen steepled her fingers, a gesture of thoughtful condescension. "We understand that, Mr. Fallon. This isn't a question of boundaries. It's a matter of aesthetic harmony, as outlined in our governing documents." She slid a bound volume across the table. "If you'll refer to the covenants, conditions, and restrictions. Article 8, Section 8.4.2, View Corridors and Aesthetic Harmony." She didn't wait for him to look. She knew it by heart. "No structure, fence, wall, or planting shall be erected or maintained, which may unreasonably obstruct the scenic vista, or view corridor from any common area, as determined in the sole discretion of the board." She looked up, her smile unwavering. "The new section of your fence, with its rustic, agricultural character, has been determined by the committee to be out of compliance with the planned aesthetic of the Serenity Trail." Grayson felt a slow burn begin in his chest. Rustic, agricultural character. She said it like an insult. He'd built that fence with cedar posts, milled from trees that had fallen on his own land. He was halfway through welding a gate from solid steel stock. It was meant to last 100 years. "The planned aesthetic," Grayson repeated slowly, "is a dirt path you haven't even broken ground on yet. My fence is on my private property." "And we respect that," Karen said, her tone softening into a parody of empathy. "We truly do. We're simply asking for your cooperation in maintaining the visual continuity that makes Harvest View Meadows such a desirable place to live. We're all neighbors here." The word neighbors hung in the air, a veiled threat. The other committee members nodded in unison, a silent chorus of agreement. Grayson was an outsider, a relic from the landscape they were actively trying to erase and replace with manicured lawns and identical mailboxes. His 160 acres of working farmland, a legacy passed down from his father, was an anomaly, an untidy patch on their pristine map. He knew arguing was futile. He was in their world now, governed by their rules, and they were the sole arbiters of what those rules meant. He had seen this before, the slow, bureaucratic strangulation of common sense. "So what's the determination?" he asked, cutting through the pretense. Karen's smile tightened by a millimeter. "The committee finds the structure to be non-compliant. We're issuing a courtesy notice, asking you to cease construction immediately and submit a formal architectural application with materials and designs that are more in keeping with the community's standards." She slid a single sheet of paper across the table. It was the notice, printed on the same creamy cardstock. "It has come to our attention. May not conform to the aesthetic guidelines. Please contact us to discuss." It was polite. It was professional. And it was a declaration of war. Grayson stood, the plastic chair scraping against the linoleum. He didn't take the notice. He looked directly at Karen McGrath. Holding her gaze for a long moment, he saw no compromise in her eyes, only the placid, unblinking certainty of someone who has never been told no. "Thank you for your time," he said. He turned and walked out of the room, the hum of the fluorescent lights seeming to grow louder behind him. He didn't need to take the paper. He knew they would mail it. They would document everything. This was just the first. Polite shot across the bow, as he stepped out into the clean, crisp afternoon air. He could feel the weight of their world pressing in on the edges of his own. The moment Grayson's truck rumbled across the cattle guard and onto his own gravel drive, the tension in his shoulders eased. Here, the world made sense. To his left, the long, low shape of the barn he'd re-roofed himself. To his right, fields of winter wheat, green and vibrant, stretching toward a line of ancient oaks that marked the creek bed. This land wasn't just property. It was a living record of his life, of his father's life. Every fence post told a story, every rut in the dirt path a memory. His wife, Sarah, was on the porch, pruning the roses that climbed the trellis. She looked up as he approached, her brow furrowed with concern. She was a high school science teacher, a woman of logic and reason, and she had a finely tuned sensor for his moods. "That bad?" she asked, setting her shears down. Grayson mounted the steps and sank into one of the heavy wooden rocking chairs, letting out a long breath. "They have a clause," he said, rubbing his temples. "A view corridor clause. They say my fence, on my land, is blocking the view from their non-existent walking trail." Sarah came and sat in the chair beside him, her presence a quiet comfort. "Can they do that?" "They think they can," he said. "They have a whole book of rules designed to let them do whatever they want. It's all about their sole discretion." He had spent 15 years making this place self-sufficient and secure. Solar panels glinted on the barn roof, feeding a battery bank that could power them for a week. A deep well, governed by a pressurized system he'd engineered, provided clean water. He had contracts with local restaurants for his produce, and a small herd of cattle that were his pride and joy. He was beholden to no one, or so he'd thought. "This is what your dad worried about," Sarah said softly. "When they first broke ground on that development, he said they weren't just building houses. They were importing a new set of rules." He was right, Grayson admitted. Later that evening, after a quiet dinner, Grayson spread his documents across the heavy oak dining table. The original deed to the 160 acres. The paper yellowed and brittle at the creases, its language clear and absolute. The county plat map, showing his property lines with unambiguous precision, and the thick, bound volume of the Harvest View Meadows CC&Rs, which the developer had been legally required to provide him a copy of years ago as an adjacent landowner, though he'd never had reason to open it. He found the clause, Forger 8.4.2. He read it again and again. Unreasonably obstruct the scenic vista. The word unreasonably was the key. It was a subjective term, a legal blank check, and the phrase that followed it, as determined in the sole discretion of the board, was the signature that cashed it. He flipped through the rest of the document. It was a labyrinth of legalese, governing everything from the approved color of mailboxes to the maximum height of holiday lawn ornaments. It was a blueprint for a world of absolute control, a world he had spent his entire life avoiding. "What are you going to do?" Sarah asked, leaning over his shoulder. She placed a hand on his back, a small gesture of solidarity. "First," he said, tracing the boundary line on his plat map with his finger, "I'm going to finish my gate. It's my land. They can send their letters. This is where it stops." He felt a stubborn resolve hardening within him. This wasn't just about a fence. It was about principle. It was about the quiet right to be left alone, a right that Karen McGrath and her committee, with their sterile meeting rooms and weaponized bylaws, seemed determined to extinguish. He closed the thick volume of CC&Rs with a definitive thud. The polite opening move had been made. Now, he would wait for theirs. The letter arrived 12 days later, not in the rustic mailbox at the end of his drive, but via a certified mail carrier who required a signature. The official green and white sticker was a small, ominous flag. Grayson signed the electronic pad, a feeling of grim certainty settling in his gut. He slit the envelope open with his pocket knife, standing right there on the porch. The cream-colored cardstock felt heavy in his hands. This was no mere courtesy notice. Dated May 15th, it was a formal violation notice. Reviolation of covenants, CC&R, Figure 8.4.2, view corridors and aesthetic harmony. Property, 1140, Old Creek Road. Tracking number, 7218, 1830, 01, 4598, XXXXX. Dear Mr. Fallon, this letter serves as a formal notice of a continuing violation of the Harvest View Meadows governing documents, as you were informed at the Architectural Control Committee meeting on May 3rd. The unapproved fence structure on your property has been deemed non-compliant with CC&R for 8.4.2. The courtesy notice issued on that date requested an immediate cessation of construction and the submission of a formal application. Our records indicate that not only has no application been submitted, but construction has continued. Pursuant to the association's enforcement policy, a fine of 100 baht has been assessed to your account. Furthermore, a daily penalty of 25 will accrue for each day the violation remains uncured. You have 14 days from the date of this notice to bring the property into compliance by removing the non-compliant structure. Failure to cure the violation will result in further enforcement action, including a summons to a formal board hearing. Sincerely, the Board of Directors, Harvest View, Meadows, HOA. Grayson read the letter twice. The politeness was gone, replaced by the cold, impersonal language of enforcement. They had put a price on his defiance, $100. It wasn't the amount that mattered. It was the mechanism. This was how they operated. They didn't use force. They used fees. They didn't break down your door. They sent certified letters that clouded your finances and threatened your peace of mind. The daily penalty was the truly insidious part, a ticking clock designed to create pressure, to make the cost of resistance mount with every sunrise. He pictured a ledger in their sterile office, a new $25 charge added to his name each morning. He walked over to the eastern fence line. The new gate was hung, a solid, handsome thing of black steel and cedar. It was a testament to his labor, a permanent fixture on his land, according to them. It was a liability, a wound hemorrhaging $25 a day. He took out his phone and snapped a photo of the letter, the certified mail receipt beside it for proof of date. He sent it to Sarah with a simple message. It started. This was no longer a disagreement. It was a formal, documented attack. The fine was the inciting incident, the transformation of a philosophical dispute into a tangible financial assault. They had created an official record, started a paper trail they could use to escalate, to justify the next step, and the next. He looked from the letter in his hand to the gate, standing proud and defiant against the afternoon sun. They had drawn their line not on the ground, but on paper. Now, he had to draw his. The board hearing was held on the evening of May 22nd, in the same soulless clubhouse annex. This time, all 5 board members were present, seated at the long table like a panel of judges. Karen McGrath presided from the center, her expression one of placid neutrality. A representative from the management company sat in the corner, typing silently on a laptop, her face a mask of professional detachment. Grayson had come prepared. He brought a binder containing his property deed, the official county survey map with the boundary lines clearly marked, and a series of dated photographs showing the progress of his fence construction. He felt a flicker of hope that clear, irrefutable evidence would prevail. The hope died quickly. Mr. Fallon, thank you for attending, Karen began, her voice echoing slightly in the quiet room. As you know, this hearing was convened to address the ongoing violation of CC&R, Fair 8.4.2. You have been given a copy of the violation notice and the relevant governing documents. The floor is yours to present your case. Grayson stood and methodically laid out his evidence on the table. Good evening. My name is Grayson Fallon. As you can see from the official county survey, he said, unfolding the large map. The fence in question is located entirely on my private property, well within the legal boundaries established in my deed. He pointed to the specific section. The accusation is that this fence obstructs a view corridor from a common area. However, the common area in question, the Serenity Trail, does not yet exist. And more importantly, the association's authority does not extend beyond its own platted boundaries. He presented his deed, its language clear and unassailable. He felt he was making a solid, logical case based on property law. The board members listened, their faces impassive. When he was finished, Karen thanked him politely. Then, the treasurer, a man named Henderson, spoke up. Mr. Fallon, we are not disputing your property lines, he said, peering over his reading glasses. The covenant, however, is not about property lines. It's about the effect of structures on the community's shared assets, namely, the views from our common areas. The bylaws you were provided clearly state that all properties within Harvest View Meadows are subject to the CC&Rs. But my property is not in Harvest View Meadows, Grayson countered, his frustration rising. I am an adjacent landowner, not a member. Karen intervened smoothly. And we appreciate that distinction. However, the original master plan, filed with the county upon the development's inception, designates a visual easement across the periphery of adjacent parcels to protect the community's aesthetic integrity. It is this easement that is governed by Section 8.42. It was the first he'd heard of a visual easement. It sounded like legal fiction, a phrase invented for this very occasion. I'd like to see a copy of that easement filing, Grayson said, his voice firm. Karen exchanged a brief, knowing glance with the board secretary. We can certainly have our management company pull that for you. For now, however, the hearing must proceed based on the documents at hand. It was a classic procedural trap. They introduced a new, unsubstantiated claim, and then deferred the evidence, forcing him to argue against a ghost. The hearing was a sham, a piece of political theater designed to ratify a decision that had already been made. They used jargon like a weapon, quoting bylaws and referencing resolutions he had no knowledge of. They were polite, maddeningly so. Every sentence began with all due respect, or as per the governing documents. After 15 minutes of this bureaucratic stonewalling, Karen called for a motion. I move that the board find the property at 1140 Old Creek Road to be in violation of CC&R 8.4.2, uphold the initial fine of $100, and continue the daily penalty of $25 until the violation is cured. Henderson said. Second. Another board member chimed in. All in favor, Karen asked. 5 hands went up. The motion passes unanimously, she declared, her face betraying no hint of triumph. Mr. Fallon, you will receive a formal notice of the board's decision within 5 business days. The fines will be updated accordingly. Thank you for your time. Grayson stood there for a moment, the binder of evidence feeling foolishly heavy in his hands. He hadn't lost an argument. He had been procedurally nullified. They had followed their rules, checked their boxes, and created a paper trail of due process that would make their actions appear legitimate to any outside observer. The hostility wasn't in their words, but in the cold, chilling precision of the system they had built. He had walked in seeking justice and had been handed a bill. The formal notice of the board's decision arrived on June 1st. It was a sterile, computer-generated invoice detailing the original fine, the accrued daily penalties, and the new total. A footnote informed him that his account was now considered delinquent. Grayson knew he couldn't fight this alone. He wasn't a lawyer. He was a farmer. He was fluent in the language of soil and steel, not statutes and subpoenas. He needed an interpreter, a guide through the legal wilderness they had dragged him into. He found one in Bill Connolly, a retired county surveyor and title clerk who had worked with his father for 30 years. Bill was a man who believed in the sanctity of a properly filed plat map and had a deep, abiding suspicion of anyone who tried to muddy clear boundary lines. He operated out of a cramped office downtown, surrounded by stacks of old maps and zoning books. Grayson laid out the whole story, from the ACC meeting to the board hearing. Bill listened patiently, his bushy gray eyebrows furrowing deeper with every detail. A visual easement. Bill grunted when Grayson was finished, turning the phrase over like a strange rock. That's a new one. Sounds like something they cooked up over brunch. They're blowing smoke. Grayson. But they're doing it by the book, their book. To beat them, you have to use the county's book. Bill became his investigator, his strategist. First thing, he advised, you file a formal records request. Under the state's Property Owners Association Act, you have the right to inspect their records. Ask for everything, all board meeting minutes for the last 2 years, their financials, all correspondence related to your property, and a copy of this supposed easement they mentioned. Grayson drafted the letter that afternoon, citing the specific state statute as Bill had instructed, and sent it via certified mail. The HOA's management company had 10 business days to comply. While we wait for that, Bill said, rolling out a massive map of the county on his light table, we go to the source, the county recorder of deeds. Their fiction doesn't matter. All that matters is what's on file down there. The next day, Grayson found himself in the quiet, dusty archives of the county recorder's office. It was a world away from the hostility of the HOA boardroom. Here, history was recorded in careful script and precise lines on aging parchment, with the help of a clerk. He pulled the original plat map for the Harvest View Meadows subdivision, filed a decade earlier. He spread it out on a table, the paper crinkling under his touch. And there it was, in black and white. The development's boundaries were clearly delineated. His own parcel. 1140 Old Creek Road was adjacent, but distinctly separate. There was no mention of any easement visual or otherwise encumbering his property. It was foundational proof. His property was, and always had been, legally independent. He then asked the clerk to search for any and all easement deeds associated with his parcel number going back 50 years. The search turned up one, and only one, document. It was a utility easement granted to the electric company in 1978 for a single power pole near the road. Nothing more. He paid for certified copies of everything: the plat map, his own clean deed, the utility easement. This was the ammunition he needed. A week later, a thick manila envelope arrived from the HOA's management company, the response to his records request. He tore it open eagerly. Inside were financials and a stack of meeting minutes. He flipped to the records for the meetings where his property was discussed. And he saw it. Entire paragraphs were blacked out with a thick, dark marker. The redactions were clumsy, angry slashes of ink. Under the heading, New Business, 1140 Old Creek Road, a long section was completely illegible. The same was true for the minutes of the hearing he had attended. The official record of their deliberations was a secret. The redactions weren't just an obstacle, they were a clue. People don't hide things they're proud of. They were concealing not just their actions, but their intent. He now had the HOA's official map, which showed him outside their jurisdiction, and their own official records, which showed they were hiding something. The smoke Bill had talked about was starting to take shape. Grayson took the stack of documents, the certified county maps, the redacted minutes, back to Bill Connolly's office. He laid them out on the light table, the black bars of the redactions standing out like wounds on the page. Bill whistled low. Well, if that isn't an admission of guilt, I don't know what is. They know they're on thin ice, so they're hiding the cracks. But it was the absence of the visual easement document that intrigued Bill the most. They mentioned it in a formal hearing, he mused, tapping a thick finger on the table. They wouldn't just invent it out of thin air. They'd have a pretext, something they could twist. Let me make some calls. I know a few old-timers in the title business. Somebody might remember something about that parcel. 2 days later, Bill called him. Grayson, you need to come down here, and you might want to sit down. When Grayson arrived, Bill had a single, faded document laid out on his desk, obtained from a contact at a rival title company. It was an easement deed, dated 1982. Here's your ghost, Bill said, pointing to a paragraph. Grayson read the typed words. It was a temporary view and construction staging easement, granted by the previous owner of his land, not his father, but the owner before him, to a developer for a project that was never built. It allowed the developer to prevent the construction of any view-obstructing structures for a limited time. And then Grayson saw the crucial line. This easement shall run with the land for a period not to exceed 5 years, and shall be considered null and void as of December 31st, 1987. It had expired 36 years ago. This is it, Grayson breathed. This is their whole case. It's built on a dead document. That's the pretext, Bill said, his expression grim. But it's not the motive. I did some more digging. Grayson, about Karen McGrath. Bill slid a piece of paper across the desk. It was a printout of the HOA's corporate filing. Karen's name was there, listed as president. But Bill had done something more. He'd run a background check. Her maiden name isn't McGrath, Bill said quietly. It's Peterson. The name hit Grayson like a physical blow. He knew that name. Everyone in the county knew the story. The Petersons had owned a massive tract of land, including the parcel that was now his. Back in the 80s, they were cattle ranchers who fell on hard times, made a series of bad investments, and ended up in a desperate financial situation. "Your father didn't swindle them, Grayson," Bill said, seeing the look on his face. "He bought the land at a public auction after the bank foreclosed. It was all legal and above board. But the Petersons, they lost everything. They blamed the bank. They blamed the economy. But mostly, they blamed the man who ended up with their legacy. Your father." Suddenly, all the pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. The obsession with his specific property line, the invention of rules, the personal, unyielding nature of the fight. "But why now?" Grayson asked. "Why after all these years?" "That's the last piece," Bill said, tapping a final document. It was an agenda from the County Planning Commission. A new item had recently been submitted for consideration, a proposal by a company called Summit Creek Development to purchase the 20-acre common area behind Grayson's property from the Harvest View Meadows HOA. Summit Creek wants to build luxury condos, Bill explained, but their offer is contingent on the land having a pristine and unobstructed view of the creek and the hills beyond. Your land. Karen isn't just trying to enforce a rule. She's trying to clear the view for a multi-million-dollar deal. And, in the process, she gets to settle a 40-year-old family grudge against the son of the man she believes ruined her family. The fight was no longer about a fence. It wasn't about bylaws or view corridors. It was about money, power, and a cold, calculated revenge that had been simmering for decades. It was deeply, chillingly personal. The ticking clock grew louder on June 15th. A letter arrived. This one from a law firm in the city, with a fancy, embossed letterhead. The language was sharp, cold, and devoid of any neighborly pretense. Re-intent to place a line. Account GR 45-88-1. Delinquent amount $2,175. Dear Mr. Fallon, this firm represents the Harvest View Meadows Homeowners Association. Our records indicate that your account is severely delinquent in the amount of $2,175.0, comprising unpaid fines and accrued penalties. This letter serves as a formal notice of our client's intent to place a lien on your property at 1140 Old Creek Road if the full amount is not remitted within 30 days. A lien will encumber your property title, may negatively impact your credit, and can be foreclosed upon to satisfy the debt. Payment should be made. Grayson's hands trembled slightly as he held the paper. This was the real threat. Not a land grab by force, but a slow, legal strangulation. A lien was a cloud on his title, a black mark that would make it impossible to sell, refinance, or borrow against his own land. It was a way to turn a manufactured dispute over a fence into a weapon that could, ultimately, cost him his farm. The amount was almost irrelevant. The legal power it gave them was absolute. He immediately called his own lawyer, a practical, no-nonsense attorney named Mabel Campbell, whom Bill had recommended. She listened to his update, including the expired easement and the Peterson connection. They're playing hardball. Grayson, she said, her voice grim. The lien is their power move, but we have the expired easement. That's our silver bullet. The problem is, we have to use it in the right place, at the right time. They want to drag this out in court, bleed you dry with legal fees. We need to find a way to end this publicly, and decisively. The HOA's next move, however, wasn't aimed at him, but beside him. His next-door neighbor to the north was an elderly widow named Eleanor Gable. She had lived in her small, tidy home for 50 years, long before Harvest View Meadows existed. Her husband had been a friend of Grayson's father. She was on a fixed income, and her greatest joy was the small garden she kept and the birds that flocked to the feeders hanging from her ancient live oak. One afternoon, Grayson saw the telltale cream-colored envelope sticking out of her mailbox. A few hours later, Mrs. Gable called him, her voice trembling. "Grayson, I don't understand," she said. "The association sent me a letter. A violation. They say my bird feeder is an unapproved structural modification that obstructs the view corridor." Grayson felt a surge of cold fury. A bird feeder. They were fining an 80-year-old woman for a bird feeder to get to him. "They fined me $50, she whispered, "and they said I have to take it down." It was a clear message. They were isolating him, demonstrating to any other potential allies that the board's power was absolute and its reach was long. They were punishing an innocent woman to intimidate him. He now faced a profound moral dilemma. He could continue his aggressive fight, which would likely escalate into a costly lawsuit. If the HOA had to spend tens of thousands of dollars on legal fees, they would almost certainly levy a special assessment against all the homeowners, including people who had no part in this, to cover the cost. His principled stand could end up hurting his innocent neighbors. Or he could back down, pay the fine, take down the gate, and live under their thumb. That evening, he and Sarah sat on the porch, the lien notice and Mrs. Gable's violation letter on the table between them. "Is this fight worth the peace it's costing us?" Sarah asked, her voice heavy with worry. "Costing Mrs. Gable." Grayson looked out over his fields, the land his father had worked, the land he had sworn to protect. The question wasn't just about a fence anymore. It was about the kind of world he wanted to live in, one where bullies with bylaws could terrorize the elderly over a bird feeder, or one where people stood up, not just for themselves, but for their neighbors. "They've made it about more than just peace," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "They've made it about what's right." He needed a new strategy, not just a legal defense, but a public reckoning. The annual homeowners meeting was held in the main ballroom of the community clubhouse. The room was packed with over 100 residents, a sea of pastel polos and concerned expressions. At the front of the room, Karen McGrath and the board sat at a long, linen-draped table, a large projector screen behind them, to the right of the podium. A bright red digital clock was displayed on a tripod, its numbers set to 5G. The timer for the Homeowner Open Forum. Grayson had registered for a speaking slot earlier that week. He sat in the third row, a simple USB drive in his pocket. He wasn't there to shout. He wasn't there to plead. He was there to present evidence. The meeting droned on with budget reports and committee updates. Karen's voice was a smooth, confident monotone, the voice of a leader in complete control. "Finally," she announced, "we will now move to the open forum. Each registered homeowner will have 5 minutes to address the board. First on our list is Grayson Fallon." A low murmur rippled through the room. Heads turned. Grayson stood and walked calmly to the podium. He nodded politely to the board and inserted the USB drive into the laptop connected to the projector. The timer started its silent, inexorable countdown. 4:59, 4:58. "Good evening," he began, his voice amplified by the microphone, steady and clear. "My name is Grayson Fallon. I know I'm not a member of your association, but your board has made me a subject of its business. So, I appreciate the time to speak." On the screen behind him, A high-resolution image appeared. It was the official county plat map. C. 30. This is the legally filed plat map for Harvest View Meadows. As you can see, the boundary of the association is clearly marked. He used the laser pointer to trace the line. And my property, 1140 Old Creek Road, is here, outside that boundary. According to the foundational document on file with our county, your HOA has no jurisdiction over my land. The image on the screen changed. It was a scanned copy of a deed. The 55. This is a document the board has cited in a hearing as the basis for its authority, a supposed visual easement over my property. I had to go to some lengths to find it, because the board was unable to produce a copy. He zoomed in on the key paragraph. It does indeed grant a view easement. However, he highlighted the final sentence. It also says, "This easement shall be considered null and void as of December the 31st, 1987. This document, the entire pretext for over $2,000 in fines and a lien against my family's property, expired 36 years ago." A gasp went through the crowd. People were sitting up straighter, leaning forward. Karen's smile was frozen on her face. The other board members shifted uncomfortably. 40. When I made a formal request for the minutes of the meetings where my property was discussed, Grayson continued, "This is what I received." The screen now showed the redacted minutes, the stark black lines obscuring the text. This is the transparency your board offers its members when making decisions that could lead to costly legal action. The image changed again, showing the same page, but this time, unredacted. He'd had Mabel file a formal legal demand, threatening a motion to compel, and the management company had reluctantly provided the clean version. 150. This is the unredacted version, Grayson said, his voice dropping slightly. He highlighted a sentence from the board's discussion. Henderson, are we sure the easement is still valid? McGrath, it's a gray area, but he won't know that. We need to control the view for the Summit Creek proposal. My family has history with that parcel. We need to be firm. The room erupted in a chorus of angry whispers. The mention of Summit Creek and Karen's family history laid the real motive bare for everyone to see. This wasn't about a community view. It was about a private development deal and a personal vendetta, funded by their dues. Karen's face was pale. She tapped her pen on the table, a rapid, nervous rhythm. 45. Grayson let the silence hang for a beat. The timer continued its relentless countdown. He then turned his gaze from the board and looked out into the audience, his eyes finding Mrs. Gable, who sat looking small and worried. My time is almost up, he said, his voice now filled with a quiet passion. But this was never just about my fence. It's about the abuse of power. It's about a board that targets an 80-year-old widow, a woman on a fixed income, with a $50 fine for a bird feeder under the same expired easement, just to intimidate a neighbor. He turned back to the board, his eyes locking with Karen's. The timer showed 10. Therefore, he said, his voice ringing with authority, I would like to use my last 10 seconds to make a motion from the floor. I move that the association immediately forgive all fines issued to Mrs. Eleanor Gable and any other homeowner under the misapplied Section 8.4.2, and that this body commission a full, independent audit of the board's communications and dealings with Summit Creek Development. The timer hit. The room was dead silent for a single, stunned second, and then it exploded. The ballroom erupted. It wasn't just whispers anymore. It was a wave of angry, indignant voices. A man in the back stood up, his face red with fury. "A motion has been made. I second that motion." Karen banged her gavel, but the sound was lost in the tumult. "The speaker's time is up. That motion is out of order. Mr. Fallon is not a member," she shouted, her voice thin and shrill. The mask of polite control shattered. The management company representative, a woman who had been typing silently in the corner, now looked up in a panic. This was a rebellion, a complete loss of procedural control. "He may not be a member, but I am the man who seconded the motion," yelled back, "and I am restating the motion." "Point of order," another homeowner called out. "The bylaws allow for motions from the floor during the annual meeting. We demand a vote." The developer's representative, a slick man in a tailored suit who had been observing from the back, saw the tide turn with professional speed. He quietly gathered his leather portfolio, slipped through the crowd, and exited through a side door. The Summit Creek deal had just died. Before the board could regain control, an older gentleman stood up. "I would like to make another motion," he said, his voice carrying surprising weight. "I move for the immediate recall of President Karen McGrath and any board member who knowingly voted to pursue legal action based on the expired easement." The room roared its approval. Karen was on her feet, her face a mask of disbelief and rage. The foundation of her authority, built on a scaffold of procedural rules and feigned transparency, had been dismantled in 5 minutes with 3 pieces of evidence. The panicked management agent finally intervened, stepping to the podium. We must follow procedure," she stammered. "A recall vote requires a petition, but the motion to forgive the fines is in order. We must vote on it." The vote was a formality. A near-unanimous show of hands shot up in favor of forgiving Mrs. Gable's fine and commissioning the audit. The few who abstained were the board members themselves, now looking isolated and powerless at the front of the room. Mrs. Gable, sitting in her seat, had tears streaming down her face, a look of profound relief washing over her. Grayson didn't stay to watch the rest. His work was done. He had planted the seeds of truth, and now the community would handle the harvest. As he walked out of the clubhouse, the sound of their angry, empowered voices echoing behind him, he felt a deep, quiet sense of justice. He hadn't just saved his own property, he had given a community the tools to save itself. Weeks later, the landscape of Harvest View Meadows had been irrevocably altered. An interim board, composed of the same residents who had led the charge at the meeting, was in place. Their first official act was to send Grayson a letter. It wasn't a violation notice. It was an apology. The lien against his property was formally dropped. The HOA's directors' and officers' liability insurance covered the reimbursement of all of Grayson's legal fees. A quiet admission of the old board's malfeasance. The independent audit was underway, and the management company, tainted by its complicity, had been served a notice of contract termination. At the interim board's first public meeting, they invited Grayson to attend. Not as a defendant, but as a consultant. He helped them draft a new, clearer bylaw, one that explicitly defined the association's boundaries and established a fair, transparent process for disputes with adjacent landowners, protecting private property rights for good. It was a gesture of goodwill, a way of mending the fence his own had nearly broken. Life on the farm returned to its familiar rhythm. The hum of the fluorescent lights was replaced by the buzz of cicadas, the sterile scent of carpet cleaner by the rich smell of damp earth after a rain. Grayson finished his gate, its black steel a symbol not of defiance, but of resilience. One afternoon, A small, anonymous package was left inside his mailbox, tucked behind the usual stack of bills and catalogs. It was wrapped in simple brown paper with no return address. Curious. Grayson took it back to the house and opened it on the kitchen table. Inside was a copy of an old, yellowed newspaper article from the local Gazette, dated 1983. The headline read, "Peterson Ranch Auctioned. Local farmer Fallon secures historic parcel." It was the story of his father's original land purchase. Folded inside the clipping was a small piece of notepaper. On it, a short, handwritten message in a tidy, masculine script. "He always said you were the better farmer. He was right." Grayson stared at the note. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that it wasn't from Karen. It was from one of her relatives, a brother, a cousin, someone who had watched the drama unfold and had chosen to offer a quiet, final peace. It was an acknowledgement not of victory or defeat, but of a truth that ran deeper than any property line or family grudge. He folded the note and the clipping carefully and put them away in his father's old desk. He stepped out onto the porch, looking out at the land stretching before him, green and whole under the vast Texas sky. The war was over, the boundary was secure, and in the quiet space that followed the storm, something unexpected had taken root.